Included in the exhibit are two works by George Kozmon. He is an internationally collected artist known for his widely exhibited and critically acclaimed monumental paintings. You see some of those big ones like 80 feet, that's monumental. In public and private collections, including the Cleveland Museum of Art. And his numerous commissioned projects include wide-ranging locations from the Key Corp in Cleveland to Halliburton Corporation headquarters in Houston, Texas, to a series of large-scale works for the Ritz-Carlton in Abu Dhabi. Quite a large range. Among his numerous awards is the National Endowment for the Arts Individual Artist Fellowship. He has had over 30 solo exhibitions in commercial, academic, and institutional venues, and has taken part in over 100 shows. George Kozmon, contemporary painter, lecturer at the Department of Art History and Art at Case Western Reserve University. Please welcome George Kozmon.
Thank you for coming. Thank you, Bundy, for a tremendous lead-in. So what I've done is I've put together a PowerPoint, and they're going to be talking about all the works that are in the show. So there's 25 works, right? Mm-hmm. And so I'll talk about not necessarily each one very specifically, but I'll talk about genres and time periods, and I'll make some comparisons to maybe things that have been done in the past historically, so that you get a contextual framework. Many times we see artwork and we like it or don't like it. You know, fair enough. And that's true for everybody, whether you're formally art educated or not. I mean, there's things that I know are good that I don't like. There's things that I know aren't very good, but I like it. So it's kind of like movies. You've probably all seen movies like, well, that was pretty awful, but it had me laughing, or it had me on the edge of my seat or whatever. So art can be like that. And it's usually the course of time that starts accumulating what the quality of that is. So you see that in museums all over the world where you start seeing some of the same names, like a Monet or a Picasso or a Van Gogh or whatever. It's like, well, the consensus over the course of decades and centuries ends up elevating certain artists. So sometimes it's hard to see that while you're in the stream of it. It takes a little bit of time. This is very informal. Feel free to ask questions or make comments. We'll go from there. Most of the work in this show are all within the last century. So there's nothing going back to the 1700s, things like that. I decided, just because you're physically here, that I would do it geographically chronologically, meaning that it's going to start with this painting and go down the line. Philosophers have been kind of asking that question forever, and there's really no definitive answer. It is a medium of communication. It's visual communication, and human beings have been doing it for a long time. You know, from the first proto-human beings that were grunting their communications with each other in the caves, they started putting stuff on the cave walls. You know, they get the charcoal from the fire or clay or whatever and start making images. And so the human capacity to understand imagery goes back 40,000 years at least. That capacity is a vocabulary. It's a visual vocabulary that we've adopted. And over the course of time, different cultures, different eras have codified these things. All the works in the show are from a specific time frame. In a sense, they share a vocabulary, but as you'll see, some of that vocabulary goes back a little bit further, whether it's from techniques or how they've chosen to deal with imagery. Laszlo Dush, he was an experimental printmaker primarily. And there's 4 pieces from him here. His work is abstract, so it's non-referential in the sense that he's not choosing imagery that we would recognize. So for him, it's about color patterns and surfaces. And to that end, when you get a closer look at some of those, you'll see that there's different textures and different fabrics. And some of it can be photo-based, some of it can be lithographically based. So he's experimenting. And I'll talk more about that as we go through the works. But what you see in things like this is a combination of form and line, you know, so there's shapes and line, which is kind of an obvious thing to say. It's like, well, yeah. Design falls into several parameters in terms of putting artwork together. There's things like color, things like line, and value. Value is how dark or how light something is. So he's exploring both line, value, texture. Color is very limited. He's not interested in color for these pieces. Mostly artists will delve into a specific area of interest and pursue that. he's also not a traditional printmaker in the sense of making one image with one plate. As Bundy said in the lead-in, there's a more detailed explanation of printmaking, but printmaking kind of falls into three categories. It all has to do with creating a multiple, to be able to create more than one image. And there's three ways to do that in essence. There's a million ways to do it, but you either etch into something, meaning you're gouging into a surface and then putting ink or some other liquid on it that goes into the gouges, and when you put paper on it and take it off, the marks are where you've gouged it in. So that's one way. So etchings are done like that. And I'm simplifying here. Another way is woodcuts. You're also gouging the surface, except the reverse happens. The ink stays on the top of the areas you did not gouge. So it's kind of like carving a negative. And then you put the paper on it and run it through a press, and there's your image. The third way is a lithographic process. Usually they used to have old litho stones, and think of like sandstone, and these things are like 100 pounds when they're this big. They're like 4-inch thick. And you take a tool and you grind it down so it's perfectly level. And then you can make marks on it with either like a grease pencil or touche, which is like an ink. And then you treat it chemically, so in that surface you're not gouging into it, it stays on the surface, and there too you'd be running it through the press. But his process is more the last, it's more lithographic, and it's very mixed media. So you can see like a fabric thing here, and up there too, which looks like cheesecloth, which is something that printmakers will use to polish the stone and clean off the residue and things like that. So he's actually using a material in the print that he's using to make the print. So there's kind of a self-referential process in that exploration for him. But this is Robert Rauschenberg, who's not in the show. He's an art historical figure in the sense he's a contemporary artist. This is dated from 70 years ago, basically. Abstraction came around in the middle of the 20th century. And a good way to think about abstraction, which we'll get to a little bit later, is basically trying to see an image when your eyes are really squinting, or if you're wearing glasses, take your glasses off. What you see is blurry shapes. And it's kind of a reduction. We think of abstraction like, okay, this is abstract art, so realism, abstraction. But I think more in terms of that abstraction is like a gradient, you know, in the sense that things can get abstracted. And so I think of it more as a verb, as a process. Somebody everybody loves to hate, Jackson Pollock. So he had like a barn, and he's taking house paint, and he's got the canvas on the floor, and he's dripping it and smoking a cigarette, and ashes are going everywhere, and he's stopping for a drink, and good times. But it is hard to understand, like, well, what makes this relevant? What makes his work historically relevant? Well, you could, just like Laszlo Deuss put in the fabric of the material that he was working with to create the piece, this is probably the first time that a painting was about paint and the process of painting. So in a sense, the visual, what he's showing you is the fact that there's an action. So the act of painting is what he's kind of nailing down. It's hard to get next to when we consider more portraits and landscapes in a more traditional setting, but nonetheless it has relevance. Artists are always pushing the boundaries. And if we think historically, the names of like a Michelangelo or Caravaggio or all these people going back 500 years, they were experimenters. They were on the cutting edge. I mean, Caravaggio was running from city to city because, you know, he was a controversial figure. So what we think of as very traditional was kind of edgy at its time. All right, Kamran Kubini. One of the things that artists generally do is they can't help but reflect where and when they live. You know, we're all kind of a victim of our moment. Artists have always reflected on both the human condition in general, in terms of how they feel about something, or just kind of autobiographical, but they've also been concerned with a sense of place. And a lot of these works are, because we document what's around us. You know, artists, you know, you go places, whether you're at home or in your city or village or whatever, but that's your world, and you can step out of it and get influences and bring them back, but you come back to your world. Many times, artists are just simply documenting for themselves, not necessarily making work to please somebody else. And really, in a lot of ways, you can go back through history. Artists are a self-absorbed breed, right? You know? We just want to make stuff that we're pleased with, because ultimately, we all know that we can't satisfy everybody, so I might as well just satisfy myself, you know? This is a lithograph. It's probably done on the stone. Lithographs can also be done on plates, like aluminum plates, but most likely this was done on the stone, going back to 1927. And you know, he's framed in the composition. So if you look at this, I mentioned values earlier in terms of dark and light values. Well, if you squint your eyes at it, you see these patterns, dark and light patterns. And if you squint hard enough, they're not that different from Laszlo Dussa's abstractions. But what he's done is he's framed it in for us. He's put a nice stable arch there, which has symmetry. Symmetry always gives us a sense of calm. It's stable. But then we're leading into this space, and he's using a little bit of perspective to wind us in, but not giving us all the details. He does, you know, he wants us to fill it in. So, for example, the stones on the street, he didn't fill up the whole street. He gave you enough information, like, yeah, we got stones here. That's all you need. So there is an aspect of art making where the artist is doing their thing, but then they expect you, the viewer, to kind of work with you. This is another one by Coubigny. This one, I believe, is hand-painted. Artists, many times, they can do a print, and with prints, I mentioned that the possibilities of multiples, you know, are there. But many times, artists will say, well, gee, I kind of like this one, but I want to do something else with it. Going back in time, 500 years ago, artists didn't have that option, you know? They could do a singular thing, and that's it. And it's just, think of it as writing, like in terms of like literacy, you know? 500, 600 years ago in Europe, most people were illiterate because there was no printing press until Mr. Gutenberg came around and created a printing press. Then we had printing presses, so information could be disseminated. That's true of imagery too. So the earliest artists, they were probably working with a master printer. If I was an artist and I did a commission for some church in Italy, I'd want to get another commission. So I would work with the printmaker saying, hey, look, let's do a print of this, and I can get more business. You know, so it's like a marketing tool, just like the internet is today. But soon artists are like, oh, well, that's not all it is. This is the medium itself can do interesting things. So they would experiment more. So this is an etching. So this is an example of it being carved into the plate and the ink sitting inside the lines that are carved. This is a Rembrandt piece, and it has some of the same qualities. Both of them have a degree of symmetry in terms of focusing your attention. Artists are manipulative creatures. We want to guide how you look at something, and we do that with contrast and lines and shapes. You have things like, you know, you have this staff, and you have this arch, again, just like that other composition where the arch gives us some stability. But then everything is kind of cluttered, really dark, except this area right here. You know, so it's focusing our attention. It's telling us where to look. And most art, you'll find kind of a primary, boom, this is where I want you to look, but then there's secondary areas all over for you to explore. And they'll bounce the light around or color if that's the case. And it's all, in a sense, it's a manipulation, but not a bad one. You know, think of it this way. I mentioned movies before. When you go to a film, 2-hour movie, you know, the director and the whole team of people, they're manipulating you. And you know, there's the love scene, there's the action scene, your palms are sweating, or they're driving through a landscape and you're like, wow, glad the good guy got away. So you're being emotionally manipulated for the 2 hours. Well, a piece of art does the same thing, except it's not through 2 hours of time, it's the time you put into looking at it, and your eye goes around and finds things of interest. So just like that's highlighted there, well, so's that hand. You know, so there's other things that you can find as you go through a composition like this. Rembrandt was one of the earliest, Rembrandt and Dürer, which I'll get to in a minute, they were the 2 earliest masters of printmaking. And partly it's because here was this comparatively new medium, and they started to play. It's like a kid in a toy store, like, what can I do with this? So there's several versions of this because he would etch it, he would print it and say, well, I want to change it. And then he would change it. So he would rework the same plate over and over again. And we're more familiar maybe with Rembrandt as a painter, but he was a great printmaker too. I had mentioned that, you know, artists responding to their environment, you know, whether it's to people or their physical environment as far as the space. And there's certainly a degree of romanticism that we'll talk about a little bit more. The prototypical Hungarian motif that goes back many years for different artists, because it's a It was a historical way to draw water for centuries. Dürer is a woodcut. He was, before Rembrandt, he was a master printmaker. You know, he was one of the first people that said, oh, this is a medium, this is a new medium. This is just like an oil painting on canvas, like we can do stuff with this. And so he really started to experiment with it. And then, in a sense, Rembrandt not took it over from him, but took that idea over from him, whatever, a century later.
So how do you choose, you know, as an artist, you're going to have something where the world's going to all die because of the apocalypse, and like, really, you want to do that and show the world?
Well, it's biblical. I mean, you have to consider the context of the time. You know, from that standpoint, a lot of the art during the Renaissance, church was the big funder of that in Western culture. That created a theme. This is biblical. By the same token, he would do drawings or etchings of things like animals. He didn't limit himself to only religious iconography. But that was a huge cultural shift in that era, and so consequently, the artists. That's what I mentioned earlier, where artists are always subject to the time and place that they live. And so that was going to be a thing. You're going to start painting crucifixes. There's going to be, I don't want to say social pressure, because you're into it. I mean, many of them had deep faith, and so it wasn't an externally driven thing. It was that moment, you know.
Thank you.
And artists will find weird things in that too. If you same kind of era, Hieronymus Bosch did these great panels of hell, you know, and there's all kinds of perversity going on in those. So he's like, you know, perverse art. It's religious, but
Get your picture on that.
yeah. Put the pointer on you.
Make that face again.
I can't. So yeah, you lost the moment. You lost the moment. No, but artists will find, because it is a part of the human condition. You know, things like the Bible or Shakespeare or whatever, they tap into primal truths. And whether you're a human being in Europe or Asia or somewhere else, yeah, the cultural context is different, but the human being isn't necessarily different. The woodcuts are also where you're gouging into the wood. And here, you're gouging into the wood, but the areas that are white are the areas that were gouged into. So the black is the higher part of it. And for a woodcut like this is a one-color print. They did the woodcut. They took a roller, put ink on it, put the paper on it, ran it through a press, and you have one color. Things like Laszlo Dush and others they can do multicolored. You can do several plates, so you're not limited to one color. There's another historical figure, Kathy Kollwitz. She did a lot of woodcuts, and they were all strong emotional stuff from family and war and things like that, and then her work was pretty amazing. But what was nice about these black and white woodcuts, both this and the one before, is the high contrast. If we went back, it says a little bit lower contrast because there's a lot of lines, and the lines end up building a lot of grays. Strong composition, you know, you have this strong horizontal, and then every shape is kind of bent over the figure. Well, this goes back a century, and you can see like these figures aren't realistic. You know, we think of oh, that's so real, that must be really good. No, not really. You think of somebody like Van Gogh, well, they weren't interested in realism. They were interested in like the deeper truths of, let's say, angst and sorrow and whatnot. They weren't trying to capture a realistic rendition of a person. They were trying to capture a state of mind. Yeah, it's a nice little piece. I believe it's a lithograph. This thing's tiny, and mother or child, you know, what's more primal than that, you know? And that's gone through history for centuries. I told them never to call me here. Is that the IRS again?
Somebody that thought he would be here apologized for missing it.
You know, let's all get on the phone and berate them. No, just kidding. Yeah, so a mother and child has been kind of a classical theme throughout. And it goes back, you know, we were talking about religious work, Jesus and Mary, you know, mother and child. This is a beautiful composition, the simplicity of it. It just kind of swirls in on the two faces. The mother is less visible than the infant. You have this glow over her head, which is almost like a halo. And it leads your eye in this circular pattern. And it's a nice little rich piece. Domyan. So this is a woodcut, but this is done with several layers of pigment. you know, you have different colored patterns. Each color has to be a separate plate. I mean, you could theoretically just do it a piece of paper, but usually what they'll do is each plate will be a color. So whatever patterns you see, like you see the red pattern, well, that was one plate. And then you see this other color, this grayer color, that's another plate. Then you see an overall pattern. That probably wasn't a carved plate. That was probably just a plate that didn't have carving on it. You just ran the colors through the press and then did the carvings on top of it, which is why you get this layered effect. It's decorative because you have this kind of bird shape and he's tapping into cultural motifs and folk motifs. But at the same time, it's very abstract. You know, you don't immediately recognize what you're looking at, so it's not a traditional drawing of a bird.
How much wine does he have to drink in order to come up with the name Edge of Paradise?
So titles are funny, and even sometimes the content of work is funny. So artists, sometimes they figure out exactly what they're doing in advance. They already have the title, they already have the whole content and concept figured out in advance. Other times we don't. Sometimes you're like, I just need to do this. You make it, and then you put a title on it. For myself, I tell this story. For a number of years, I did these big canvases, and there was architectural ruins, and there were stairs that were going down into the water, and then there was water reflecting the ruins of the architecture, and I was just compulsively doing these stairs. Like, why? Where's that coming from? About a decade later, I had this memory, and I'm sorry, I didn't have a memory. I was with my family, and we went to Switzerland, where I had lived as a little kid. And we're right on Lake Lucerne, and lo and behold, there's these stairs that go into the water. So sometimes you have these memories or these things that you're not even conscious of them necessarily. I mentioned, you know, abstraction was big in mid-century, mid-20th century. There were different schools of abstraction, if you will. Some were more geometric, some were more organic. And the idea of these shapes that would just elicit a response like, oh wait, what's going on? Is this a face? Is this a body? Is it vertical? So it's almost like vertical lines tend to associate with a figure, and horizontal lines tend to associate with landscape. So even when it's completely non-referential, you can still kind of start interpreting things to it. This too was done with 3 plates, the blue, the black, and the gold, creating a shape. La Dagnibra. So mid-20th century, he was more interested in organic shapes versus geometric shapes. And I know some of my teachers at the Institute, 2 of the teachers I had that were both abstract artists. One was Ed Michkowski, who I know you know, and you know, Ed Michkowski and Julian Stanchak. These guys were heavy hitter, deep philosophical thinkers about how color interacts and how shapes interact. And they were purely architectural in the sense that it was all about squares and lines. But the other school of thought, like the Jackson Pollock, was much more organic. It's abstract in the sense we don't know what's going on, but that certainly looks like something catching something else or letting something else go. So there's associations that we can develop by looking at something like this. Or this has kind of a figural element too. Is that a person, a head? Mostly abstraction doesn't answer a question, it asks them. So you have to bring your own ideas to the table. These things are open to interpretation, and that's what makes them intriguing in some ways. And then there's also things where you can't see it that much on the image, but you know, this is a really heavily textured area, as is that, and you know, the other black areas. So the textures are different. And one of the things that started to happen in the mid-20th century is that artists didn't hide the process of how something came about anymore. Because back further in time, in the 19th century and the 18th century, it was more like, well, the muse struck and the artist produced something and there would be an unveiling and so on and so forth. But I think mid-20th century, we started paying homage to the process itself and recognizing that oh, it's interesting to see the layers of things that are happening. Consequently, areas like this, the paint isn't as opaque as it is over here. It's a little bit more translucent. And so he's letting you in on a little bit of the process of how this whole thing came to be. And then there's color. You know, I mean, the colors here are very simple. The primary colors are red, yellow, and blue. And he's got a blue, he's got a red, and the yellow is more like a tannish color. And then he's got this huge field of green. but then it's not complicated in color. He wanted to keep it really simple. This is a contemporary, 20, 30, 40 years ago, Julian Schnabel, who's a great filmmaker too, by the way. But he was doing these giant abstractions, and this is huge, it's 12 feet. There's a kind of control, non-control with abstractions like this, where there's specific areas of control. I mean, these are brush strokes, for sure. He's controlling this shape. But then there's other areas where there's all these drips and things that are happening serendipitously. This was probably something he didn't want that aggressively, and so he scrubbed it out. And this is kind of what I mean about process. So he's letting you in on the game, on how some of this happened. And probably we could argue that Jackson Pollock started that whole idea of letting the process be revealed along the way. Our Geiger, Deutschland, it's a canvas, probably mid-20th century, maybe later. And I'd mentioned kind of a sense of nostalgia, like with a well, the Gémesgut. Certainly for the Hungarian themed works, especially when a lot of these people became expatriates, they had to leave their country, whether it's after the First World War, Second World War, 56. And so there was certainly going to be a romanticizing of the past and what they had to come from. This idyllic kind of peasant scene that would resonate with a great audience, as well as for the artist's own sense of nostalgia. But it's not unique to Hungarians. The 19th century romantic idea of the purity of the peasant, or when it was translated to indigenous cultures, like the noble savage, like somehow that was better than industrial society. And so there's a romanticism that goes along with that. Francois Millet, he did a lot of peasant paintings, and for a lot of them he would actually keep the horizon really low to the ground so the peasant would look heroic, because he was really trying to elevate the peasant working in the field. And then a more romantic version, this is here in the Cleveland Museum of Art, I'm sure some of you recognize it. Bouguereau, he took that idea of the peasants and in a sense formalized it even more and created these beautiful compositions. This is one of my favorite paintings from him, he's great. She's looking right at us, so she's engaging the viewer. This figure here is pretty brilliantly done. That's called foreshortening. So like life drawing, when you have a model and the model is, let's say, a reclining model, and you're seeing this kind of view, foreshortening is much more difficult. And the artist actually has to think abstractly, because it's not a view we're used to. We're used to seeing each other standing or sitting, but not in positions like that. Some of his stuff got a little sappy. There were only so many big brown-eyed peasant girls he could look at. But unarguably high quality. He's a painter's painter. But where I'm going with this is that at different eras, this was a tradition, the 19th century, the nobility of the worker in the fields and whatnot. There's another Gémesgut right there, another well. So another idyllic setting. So oil painting, that was a medium that was developed somewhere during the Renaissance. I mean, these mediums went through experimentation for centuries before they codified, but in the 20th century, you could start going to the art supply stores and getting this stuff. But before that, they were out in the fields collecting bugs and plants and whatever to grind down and to make colors. There's another oil on canvas, Jenő Kárpát. View of Lake Balaton. It's a standard place that a Hungarian might have gone. Whether he lived there or not, I don't know. But it would certainly be something that would resonate with both how he felt about the place and how maybe somebody else would. You can also see this was pretty quickly painted. You can see the brush strokes were almost like slapped on, and so contrary to the Bouguereau, where like you can look at next time you're at the art museum, go and look at this painting. Like you can look at the colors in the skin. It's like it feels like there's green, blue underneath the pink. It's like, oh, how did he do that? But he's hiding. He's not telling you how he did it. He's not showing you. Where here, you can see how he did it. He's getting a different effect, and it's a little bit more of a contemporary feel to it, because he's letting you in on the secret.
I was going to ask you about those painters, the ones that do paintings in just a few minutes. And,
yeah.
Speed.
So speed, or how quickly, like worth the value of a painting and how long it took somebody to make it. isn't relevant. I mentioned this guy a couple times, Bouguereau. So in this era, this is when the Impressionists came around, right? And people like this guy, the salon painters, they hated the Impressionists because these Impressionists would go out like, you know, they're like, oh, you didn't even work on it, you know? And so it was one of those things where they had a hard time getting next to that. When somebody's painting in oils, they usually have a palette in their hand and they've got their colors squeezed out. Every artist might do it differently. They might put a bunch of reds, a bunch of blues, a bunch of yellows, maybe browns. And with oil paint, you're mixing things like linseed oil and turpentine and various oils to work it. So you've got this in your hand, you probably have a rag, you've got the brush, you're dipping into like the oil, and you're mixing colors. So the edge of your palette will have the pure little pools of color, but the inside of the palette is going to look like a mess. But what's nice about that is when he grabs a green and mixes it, whatever was there before mixes a little bit into it. And so you end up with much more complexity. A starving artist won't do that.
There you go.
I mentioned that, different traditions. Ruysdael was a great landscape painter going back 400 years. So the idea of a landscape, that, it's funny, we're so used to seeing things, like, oh yeah, it's a landscape. Yeah, but like before this, landscapes kind of didn't exist, Like they started using landscapes in the Renaissance or more in the medieval times where it served as a backdrop for the actors, in the sense whether it was a religious scene or a depiction of a war or whatever. So landscapes in and of themselves, that wasn't a thing. It took many years until people said, no, how about that? Landscapes just by themselves are relevant ideas.
What is a man and a dog though?
Yeah, he's got a figure. He's got a figure standing there and the dog, but they're not relevant. In the sense that it's not about the figure and the dog. It's about this broader context.
And a lot of people never lived more than a few feet from the city that they lived in, the community. Right. To see a landscape that they're not used to would be pretty amazing.
Well, or exotic, like I know when 17th, 18th century, you got into the Americas and everything, that was a lot of exotic landscape to the Westerner. Or similar era, there was a lot of work that was inspired by Morocco and things like that, so it had this Eastern influence. The exotic was always a part of it. Something like a landscape could be both exotic or self-referential in terms of nostalgia, or just a reflection of where you're at. It's a more contemporary version of a landscape. Really rough treatment of the surface. You can paint with a brush and you can aggressively use a brush, but you can also use the other side of the brush. Use the tip. You turn it over and create gouges, if you will, on the canvas to create the branches and stuff like that. When we look at work like this, it's clear that it's a landscape, it's a winterscape. There's sky ground, there's trees, it's a tree line. One would assume that that's a field of some kind. But the surface of it owes something to like the Jackson Pollock. So here too, the slapping on the paint in a quick fashion. Question is, there's a Picasso story about speed of work, and whether it's true or not doesn't matter. It's just a story where somebody commissions Picasso to do, I don't know, a drawing of a dog or whatever, and he's like, all right, yeah, come back in 2 months and we'll get a drawing of the dog. All right, Picasso's already an old master, right? And so the person comes back 2 months later and says, oh, I'm here for my dog. Like, what? I commissioned you to do a dog. I gave you the down payment. It's like, oh yeah, okay. He goes into the other room, the studio, and the guy follows him, and he takes out like a big brush and black ink and puts out a piece of paper, and he does one of these things, and here's your dogs. And the guy's like, what? I paid you $50,000. It took you 10 seconds. And then the story goes that he took him to the adjoining room where there were stacks and stacks of drawing of dogs. To be able to do what he did in 10 seconds, you had to put in years. It's probably not a true story, but it tells the tale. You're getting a sense of a landscape but without getting the details of it. And just to get you an idea of that, this is contemporary in the sense that it was done in the last 50 years, and we think of it as like, well, this is more modern, but this is El Greco from a long time ago. And how is that not modern? It's equally modern. Toledo as a city is kind of on a hillside. It's elevated above the areas around it. Greco really leaned into that with these patches of green and the line of the city as it zigzags across the page. And look at those clouds. I mean, this was before drugs. But he was also interested in how we feel about a place, not just how the place is depicted. So if you went to Toledo, and in that era, I'm sure it looks different today, but if you went in that era, you'd probably say, hey, wait a minute, that's not where this building is. It's over here. Well, that's because he did whatever he wanted to, because he's an artist. Artists, I tell my students, like, you make your own reality. You can use reality as a starting point, but you make your own reality. Whether it's El Greco and his view of an actual city, or a bridge somewhere in a park somewhere or wherever, it doesn't matter. Sometimes it does when you're trying to get a specific likeness, but if you're trying to get a sense of a place, then it doesn't. There's another more feeling more contemporary, but here too, it's 1893. George Innes was a great American landscape painter. And here he's going for like the softness of it. He doesn't want to give you details. He just wants to give you this ephemeral feel for the place. And just like the Ruisdael, where there's a figure, but the figure's not, it's not the main protagonist in the show. It's, the landscape is. Now we've moved on to still lifes, and there's a couple of small still lifes all the way in the back, and they're masterfully painted, oil on wood panel. And here too, still life is a little bit like landscapes. Like, we've seen a bunch of still lifes over the course of our lives, and so we kind of think, well, they've always been around. Well, they weren't. Still lifes were contemporary at a certain point. Landscapes were contemporary at a certain point. And there's a strong tradition of it, which I'll talk about. One of the traditions is to have the edge of the table right up front, so you can have things hanging off of it to give you that sense of illusion of space. Most of the people that would do these more classical still lifes, they were really good technicians. Kind of like that Bouguereau painting of the figure. They really knew how to get the glass to look reflective, or the brass, or the orange to feel like you could take a bite out of it. Colors leap around in a way that does have an awareness of abstraction. The color of this fabric is not accidental. This has that kind of turquoisey, bluish green color. Well, that's what that color is. So there's a dialogue between these two shapes. This one is convex in terms of its round, but this one acts as a concave shape, kind of matching it in a completely different way. So there's things that artists do, and many times they do them just innately without necessarily thinking about it. But other times things like that happen because they're aware of it and they're just used to doing it all the time. You can go back to somebody like Vermeer, where it's like a stage set. They're staging. That's what photographers do. They'll stage a whole area. This is a historical piece. So the Dutch, in the mid-17th century, became these master still life painters. And they were competing with each other, who could outdo each other in terms of their fine skills. And as I pointed out, they definitely would have things that would lean across the table and so on. And many times they had a metaphorical content. Things would have meaning. This is contemporary in the sense that it's in the show today. That's another example of still life, but it's more painterly. It's not as tightly painted as the Dutch did. But one of the things that the Dutch started to master is the metaphorical aspect of still life in terms of memento mori, like about human hubris. A lot of them would have a skull in it, like, hey, you're not going to be around forever. Or things that would represent the passage of time, like a candle or a key. There were these different symbols. So they developed a whole vocabulary of symbols that had different meanings. And the traditions of that can become apparent today. Where was it? Yeah, okay, so there's a candle. Candle snuffed out, which might have suggested that whoever's book collection it is might have shuffled off this mortal. But these were definitely somebody, like in that era, somebody would see this painting, they wouldn't only say, oh wow, look at how well they rendered the skull. They would understand every aspect of what those things mean. Cityscape, which is in essence a subgenre of landscape. And one of the things you'll notice is the really heavy impasto brush strokes. And they're really caking it on. And back to this idea of every painting, every drawing is partly, the content of it is partly about the medium in which it's made. So every print you see is partly about printmaking. Every oil painting you see is partly about the nature of oil painting. So here the artist is reminding us that, yeah, I'm creating this illusion, but it's also about slabbing paint onto a surface. And we might think of that as a modern idea, but then there's good old Vincent, you know? That was a long time ago, and that's what he was doing. You know, he's slabbing on that thick slabs of paint. He could have done like 5 times as many paintings if he would have just thinned down his paint. Right? But no, I mean, his intention was clear. And if you look through art history, for all the artists, their intention was always really clear. Yes, there might have been mystery to the content, but nobody questioned like, hey, Vinny, do you really want to paint that thick? No question, of course he did. You know, that's what he was doing. And it made you aware of the process of painting as well as kind of the emotional content. That's not a realistic sky. You know, he's reflecting on how he feels about it. I'm not going to talk much of mine, because that sounds a little self-serving, I guess. This era of my work, you know, going back a long time, I was playing with ideas of perspective. I had mentioned symmetry. So, you know, this is a symmetric composition, but then the vines break it up. I'm also mixing up, so sometimes perspective is one of those things where you can use perspective to create the illusion of space. Here I'm not using perspective. These are what might be referred to as isometric drawings, where it's flat. These are not rounded in any way. It's like seeing it flat. Yet I'm kind of implying that there's space in between as we go back. So I'm kind of playing games. Thank you.
Do you take a picture of this actual painting or thing and then paint from the picture? Or
yes and no.
Is it your...
No, I mean, this is, so if you went up on the rooftop of the Duomo in Florence, Santa Maria del Fiore, you'd see this railing, you'd see this motif. It would have, you know, these different inlaid stones in it. You'll never find this view because that's fictitious. So it's based on a real place. The one before it was based on a garden in the south of France. It was built over some Roman aqueduct, Roman baths, called the Fountain Garden in the city of Nîmes. And so there too, you would never, I mean, they had these kind of classical railings, and I liked the timelessness of them. Yes, it's of a specific era and it was a specific place, but I like the fact that it could be any era, any place. So I did take a bunch of photographs, but none of them looked like this or the next one, because I would just use them as, what I said before, where artists like, no, take the reality and then do with it what you will. So here on this is kind of a one-point perspective where I mentioned like the arch in the earlier pieces, the smaller pieces. So in a sense, I'm using this motif to create an arch. It's just a repeat of this pattern. This is symmetric, lines up exactly in the center of the piece, but then everything else doesn't, so I kind of shifted it. I'd mentioned process before, and you'd have to go up to the piece, but I fully embraced that idea of letting the process be revealed, not hiding the process. So the way these canvases, both of them started, is that they're big canvases. I would gesso them, which is like it's like a primer, and then I would play Jackson Pollock. I'd be throwing paint at it, and the paint would run and drip. And so you can actually see, like you can see a drip there, you can see a drip there. It actually was upside down. So I played. You know, I'm like most artists in the show, they're aware of the abstract qualities of work, and then we make choices like, what do you want to do? In this moment in my life, that's the work I was doing. You know, these architectural experiments, and I found them compelling. You know, I don't do that today. I'm doing something else, because artists usually don't stay in one place. Usually we end up meandering, where one thing leads to the next. My analogy for it is like a spiral staircase, where you can see the next couple of rungs, but then you really don't know where you're going.
How about inspiration? You know, whether it's spiritual or visual reality, how do you incorporate that inspiration into art?
Usually inspiration is related to sweat equity. You work. There was a lull, I remember in my mid-20s, and actually some of you might know Adam Wajah from way back when. He was a Jesuit priest that was in the Boy Scout, Girl Scout context. He would be like the wise man that would slap you around to set you straight. And matter of fact, if he didn't give you one of these, like, oh, what did I do? Anyway, so one night at one of the camps, it's like 1 o'clock in the morning, and we're walking down the path up in Fillmore, and I'm sharing with him that I've been struggling with some ideas and paintings. I'm kind of hitting a lull, a creative lull. And, you know, he stops in mid-path, and I wasn't complaining, I was just kind of sharing because we were friends. But he stops in mid-path, and you know, I did too, and then he smacks me on the head. He's like, it's not up to you. Now granted, he was a theologian, and that's where he's coming from. He goes, God gave you a gift. I don't want to hear this crap about, oh, I'm a good God. You know, it's like that's self-indulgent BS, you know. It is and it isn't. But usually, like, I get ideas when I work. If I don't work, I don't have ideas. And most artists are like that. It's just, you work. And that's, the muse, it's one of those things where good fortune is preparedness meeting opportunity, right? Same with art. If you're not, good fortune doesn't just happen. You have to put yourself in the position of making something happen. And so making work, for every piece of work I do, there's 10 that suck, you know, that want to go in the dumpster or whatever, you know, because you know, I mean, I try to fix them or work them, but the fact is you have to do a lot of failures to get to the successes. And many of the works become stepping stones for other things that you don't know yet until you go through the process.
Do you ever feel like you're finished? Do you go back to paintings and you want to change it or improve
Yes and no.
or?
Yes and no. So a good buddy of mine who was out drinking with me last night. Always good to do that when you're preparing for a presentation. So he'll go back and take paintings 10 years old and he'll paint over 90% of them. And he won't change what it was, he'll just get rid of what it was. So there might be a little window remaining and just he'll completely obliterate it. And I won't, I'm generally like, hey, that's the decision I made then, what an idiot. And I leave it alone, you know? And it's not, there's not one right way or wrong way. There are a couple paintings where like, that really is horrible, but I think I can salvage it. Because we're our own worst critics, you know? So any of the paintings, like the last two, would I paint them today the same way? No, I wouldn't. I would do something different with them.
You're in a different place now.
All right, I'm not the same person. That was half my life ago, which is insane. But yeah, we go through changes, and it's one of those things, like if you think of it like with life, of the decisions that any of us made when we were 20, 30, whatever, you probably wouldn't make those same decisions today. So it's the same kind of thing. He's trying.
George, when you express yourself, are you motivated mostly to please yourself or your
Yes.
potential audience?
No, myself. No, as a matter of fact, I've always considered the studio as a sanctuary where the world doesn't come in. And the perversity of it is that there's the marketplace. So I put a price on the work and I try to sell the work. But I never wanted the marketplace to influence my work. So for example, let's say I did a series of blue pieces and a series of red pieces. And let's say all the blue ones sold, but the red ones didn't. Well, from a business standpoint, it's like, well, stop doing red ones, dumbass. Start doing but that's not, like, I can't do that. So I'm a purist. I'm a purist at heart. And that can be self-destructive, but it can also be fruitful because at the end of the day, you want to please yourself. And you want to hope that with the integrity that you're putting into something, that the rest of the world will come along with you.
When you paint, do you listen to a particular type of composer's music?
Sometimes I like aggressive, heavy metal. Sometimes it taps into that primal energy. By the same token, so does a good Sibelius or something. So I like Vivaldi is too low key for me. I like more robust music when I work. In terms of other artists, artists all look at other artists, and but generally it's we all do our own thing, and so the inspiration from other artists is so filtered that you would never have a direct, like, oh, that looks like Bob's work, it would be too filtered. But yeah, I mean, what our artists have always, music, literature, all the arts do feed each other in that way. So, yes, sir.
Another question for you, sponsorship. If you had a sponsor, in other words, a source of income.
Thank you for your offer.
Yeah. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I
So
do.
let's give you this
I think
sense of
there's
freedom
less of that.
No pressure to actually create.
I think that does happen. I've never had that experience directly. Anything like that was always a commission, where, like we mentioned the Abu Dhabi thing, where like, all right, you got to do 12 canvases, they're going to be this big, and I worked with a designer over the course of months, and we figured it all out, and we did it. But in terms of just having that opportunity, which galleries used to do that. So back in the day, in the mid-60s and 70s, Leo Castelli was a big New York name gallery, and he actually would give his artists a stipend to just work, to just create. So I've had good opportunities. I can't complain. Any other questions, or should I let everybody just attack the food table? Thank you very much.